Hi and welcome back with another ZBrush tutorial series. In this series I will be showing you how I made this character in ZBrush, Maya and Substance Painter. So as you can see that most of my character I start from a base mesh and then sculpt details in ZBrush, and later on I retopologize it in Maya and then bake it in marmoset and then texture it in Substance Painter. So that's my basic workflow. The techniques I use for my characters are mostly for game characters. As you can see that for hair I use the hair cards to make the hairs. I took the poly counter a bit too much because it was a personal project. For game characters we usually keep the poly count around about 100k for hero characters, and for NPCs we make it right 50 or 60k polys. So most of the my techniques are for game characters, and as you can see that when I'm sculpting on my characters I mostly focus on the primary and the secondary forms of the character and sculpt them with the clay builder brush, because that's what I'm mostly comfortable with. The main there are three things that are very important when working on characters. The first is the bony landmarks that are visible. For example, right now I'm working on the rib cage and I'm showing the volumes of the rib cage wherever it is visible. Because the bony landmarks are the most important part of the character. They make up the skeleton. For example, even if you sculpt all the muscles and all that stuff, but if the bone landmark is not correct, your character will look broken in the end. And the second thing is the muscles and how they are connected from bone to bone. So it's very important that you know about what muscles connect to which place of the bones. For example, right now I'm working on the sternocleidomastoid. It starts from the mastoid process, which is below the ear, and attaches on sternum, which is on top of the ribcage. So right now I'm working on the cheekbones, or you can say the zygomatic bone, and I'm adding volumes to it. I'm also making sure that the form of my lips are correct and looking at the curvature of the bones underneath it, because bones are the main and important landmark. So the third one, the very important landmarks in the character is the fats. Because as you can see, the people that want to look more pretty and cool, they used to go to surgeries, and the surgeon adds fats into different portion of the face, and then they look like pretty and nice. So that's the same with sculpting. When you're sculpting the faces, make sure that the fats are added onto the places. So for my character I was going for a more Japanese or Chinese eye, which is the eye with double eyelid, and I'm sculpting the double eyelid right now, and making sure that the form of eyelid is correct, and I'm using standard brush to remove some volume. Sometimes I use standard brush to remove some volumes. Let me tell you something about my brushes that I use all the time. So 90% of the time I use my 6 of the most basic brushes, like move brush, standard brush, clay builder brush, inflate brush, and clay tubes and Damien standard. So for all of my sculpt, if I can make any type of character with these 6 brushes. The other brushes are special purpose brushes that I use sometimes, like the pinch brush and the hard surface brushes like the trim dynamic or the planar brush. So right now I'm sculpting the lips. I'm making sure that the fat pads of the lips are added. For the upper lip, there are 3 fat pads that I'm sculpting right now, 3 major landmarks: the center fat pad and the other 2 on the rights. And for the bottom lips I'm adding 2 fat pads because there are 2 fat pads, and I'm making sure that the ending of the lips is there is a concavity in the lips, and I'm making sure that I'm adding. So right now I'm sculpting since the orbital muscles are circular and they attach on the medial side near the nasal bone. There is a small opening which I'm making sure I'm emphasizing on it through sculpting. I'm also making sure that sometimes artists mistake the thickness of the lower eyelid. They make the thickness a bit less, a bit, I mean, less thicker. So usually, for example, if a person is a giant and the lower eyelids thickness is that much that a human can stand on it if it was a giant or something like that. So the thickness is very important because it will when light hits, it will create a different planar and it will create a different breakup. So the thickness is very important. I'm working on and emphasizing that the eye sockets are very clear in the sculpture. So as you can see that I'm working on the facial fat pads and adding volumes to it using my clay builder brush. Most of the time I'm smoothing out the different forms of the face because there are sometimes little rims created on the face, which I usually like to avoid because it makes the face look a bit weird. So right now I'm working and emphasizing the thickness of the lower eyelid, which I told you that it is very important to emphasize the thickness of the lower eyelid, because otherwise even the thickness of upper eyelid is very important as well. So I'm making sure to emphasize it and making sure that it is very clear in the sculpture, because otherwise the eyes will look weird no matter how it is. I'm making sure that his cheeks look a bit plump and the fats are added onto it. So I'm making sure that I'm adding the volumes to it and refining the shapes of it. For nose, I sculpt the nose is mainly consists of cartridges, and I'm emphasize it as well. So for the clothing part, I usually mask with my mask lasso brush and extracted the surface. So for this character, the coat it was wearing a coat, and which is very difficult to create in ZBrush because for working on thin surfaces is really tricky in ZBrush, and it takes a lot of time to refine the shapes. So I added the thickness using the panel loops. It is located under in your geometry tab, and there is panel loop. For I just put it in the top of my UI because it's easy to reach it from there. So I'm working on the different landmarks and sculpting them with my Damien standard brush. So for this pointy edges of the body, I turned on my accurate curve modifier in my move brush and then just stretched it out. So I added thickness to the code, and then I masked it from the inside out because I want this separate panel on the edge of the code. So I'm making sure that it is there. So I extracted it, and in my display properties I checked it double-sided, because in order to show the double-sided surfaces I need to make sure that it is turned on. So I'm using clay buildup to bring it out of the body, and for the pointy edges right now there are in worse shape, so I will refine it using my polish by features. It is located under the deformation tab. So you can right now I was polishing it up, and it will make sure the edges are clean. So as I told you, the most basic brushes, the 6 brushes I told you are my most basic brushes, and I use them all the time. For special purposes I use polish by features, sometimes polish by groups, or sometimes inflate. So I use deformation tabs to make sure my mesh is clean. I use masks all the time because I want to preserve one area from another from sculpting. So yeah, I added thickness onto the code, but I will remove it later on because it was very difficult to control it. So I kept it single-sided, but I decided to add thickness to it later on when it gets baked and it's ready for texture. So for game characters, sometimes I use this technique so that because thickness is a very thin surface, they are very difficult to sculpt. For clothing, I usually like to work on single-sided surfaces before refining the form, and later on adding thickness to it using the panel loops. Right now I'm adding volumes to it using my clay builder brush and refining the form using my move brush. Sometimes I use mask by features and with border turn on, which makes the single-sided surfaces locks on the edges, and then I can sculpt on the middle side and add volumes to it without disturbing the rest of the forms. So using move brush is accurate curve modifier. I'm adding the pointy edges onto my cloth meshes, and then remeshing it up and cleaning up the volumes. So for clothing, clothing is very different, and a lot of people struggle with it, and they don't know how to add different like folds and sculpt it. So when we get to the folding part and how to sculpt cloth folds, I will share my techniques with you in order to help you with it. So yeah, here I will remove the thickness because it was very difficult to control the edges in the coat. For the middle shirt, I'm creating multiple polygroups because I want to show it like it's a two panel of clothes on top of each other instead of just a single panel and sculpting details on top of it. I'm making sure that they come on top of each other. I just polygrouped it using my masking brush and then separate it and then added panel loops to add thickness to the mesh. So because panel loops separate the group when you add paneling, even though the back vertices were merged together, because it's adding thickness on the groups, so it will make these meshes separate. So I masked the middle part and then extracted it and created this center paneling of the coat that connects two pieces together. And now I'm zremeshing it and refining the form using move brush. So sometimes zremesher it just smooths out the corner, so you should make sure that you should just enhance it so that when you zremesh it, it will preserve the corners. So I moved the thickness from my code because it was messing up with the rest of my meshes and it was a bit difficult to handle. I'm making sure the pointy edges are correct and adding a bit of dynamic nature to my clothing, like it's flaring out. So I haven't added my detail on the sculpture right now because I am working on the primary forms and I'm making sure the primary forms are correct. So for here I just masked the head surface and then extracted it out, and now I'm adding volumes using my clay builder brush, and then I'm moving the mesh with my move brush and creating all these hair banks. And because these hairs will be deleted in my final mesh, I'm not spending a lot of time creating detailed hairs because I like to make hairs with hair cards. I use game techniques and I'm creating each of the separate bangs with Damien strand brush, and right now I just remeshed it up and now I'm creating sharp hair bangs with my Damien standard brush. So because these hairs will be deleted in the final mesh, I'm not very concerned about the details of the hair. I'm just sculpting it and refining the forms. Since symmetry was turned on accidentally, so I just undo the whole process and I'm sculpting it again. So right now I'm adding my hair bangs. Usually when I'm working with hairs, I usually add crisscross patterns while working with the smaller bang or the detail hairs. So as you can see that each and every stroke of mine is sculpted in a way that it cuts through different hair bangs. It doesn't overlap, and it doesn't look weird, because for here they do overlap, but it makes it look like a crisscross pattern, like multiple lines crossing on top, crossing each other and ending, and the next line starts right from there. So as you can see, I masked the legs and extracted the surface in order to make pens. So for some time I use Marvelous Designer to make clothes, but most of the time I prefer to make clothes in ZBrush, because it doesn't take a lot of time. For Marvelous, if I'm working on a professional project, I will use Marvelous Designer to make the clothes. So for the cloth folds, you should make sure that it starts from a tension point. So for example, the tension points are where the joints are. For example, cloth folds will generate from the shoulder, or the cloth folds will converge towards your knee. So for the tension points, I make sure that I converge or start a lot of my folds or cloth wrinkles from there and converge it there. So while working on characters, when you're starting on a character, it doesn't look good always from the scratch, but if you spend enough time on it, ultimately the forms will get refined. For example, as you can see, my character, it looks awful right now, but I know that if I keep spending enough time on it, it will look good at the end. So if you're making character and you are thinking like this looks awful right now, and it won't turn out good in the end, so you should think that everyone's character is almost really bad in the start. Sculpting is just a refinement process, and it takes a lot of time to refine your characters and in order to make it. So for the paneling and the different carvings on the clothes, I use my mask lasso brush and mask out the surface. Right now I'm refining the edges of it. So after masking, if I'm using my inflate with a value of 2 or 1, and then adding an inflate balloon of 0.3, the inflate and the inflate balloon sliders under the deformation tab in your tool submenu. So I use these for creating some carvings on my clothing. So I for the different carvings of the code, I decided to just sculpt it on the model, but later on I decided to just extract the surface, because it will give me a more control on it. And as you can see, I'm masking it out, and then I will extract it. So your the lines while sculpting is very important. You shouldn't, even if you have shaky hands or something like that, you should work on to improve it. And you can turn on your lazy mouse so that the lines are smooth. And it is also very important that you work on your lines, and the lines shouldn't be as shaky, because it will mess up the character, and it will look weird because it won't be as smooth as it needs to be. So I'm using my standard brush to add a bit of the volume on the edges of this panel. So if you're a beginner and you're watching my tutorials right now and you don't understand which tool and which brushes or other stuff I'm using right now to create all these details, I will be making a tutorial series on ZBrush in which I will be covering each and every tool sets in ZBrush, almost each and every tool set in the ZBrush, and covering all the necessary pieces of information that is very important in creating a character in ZBrush. So it will be a 20 to 30 hours long tutorial series, and I will add it in a week or two from. So I'm doing the same stuff over and over again, masking the surface and extracting it out, refining it using my zremesher, and then adding details using my move brush or standard brush, and cutting into the surface using my standard brush. So refinement takes time while working on character, because there is a lot of moving, lots of smoothing, and lots of other stuff. As you can see that right now I'm adding colors to the mesh, because these colors will be converted into an ID map that I will later on use in my substance painter for masking my materials. So as you can see, most of my panels I am using the same thing, like extracting it out and then adding details using my brushes. I could have just sculpted it straight up on the coat, but because it doesn't, you can, if I divided my code to more than 15 million, it would have slowed down my PC. So I decided to make it into separate meshes so that I have more control on it as well, and my PC doesn't get slowed down. Well, it wouldn't have slowed down on 15 million, maybe, right? About if it was more than 30 million, it would have slowed down. So yeah, this density on a single subtool matters in ZBrush, so you should make sure that your poly count on a single subtool doesn't exceed more than 30 or 40 million, because even if you have a good computer, it will slow it down. Right now my processor is 3900, Ryzen 3900. I'm using that for my ZBrush, and with 32 gigs of RAM. So even if I make it 45 million or 30 million, if I make it more than 45 million or 30 million, it will definitely slow down my PC. So if I keep the limit under 30 or 40k, I can definitely take the overall poly count of all of my subtools to more than 150 million, and it will run really smooth. So it is very important to manage how you subdivide your subtools and how you're dividing your different pieces, different mesh pieces. Yeah. So learning character art is a very long and difficult process. You have to be very patient while learning the character art, because art is really difficult and it takes a lot of time to master it. It has been 4 to 5 years since I am working in the industry, and I haven't mastered it yet. So if you're thinking like my character looks awful and all that stuff, I remember when I did my first character, it looked like a weird evil piece of pudding or a jello or something like that. It didn't look like a character from any angle. So you shouldn't worry about your character doesn't look okay. You shouldn't worry about that. In the start, everyone has to start from somewhere, and it won't look good in the start. So for the paneling of the clothing pieces, I use my diamond standard brush to cut into it, and then use my standard brush to add volumes to it. Right now I'm working on the sleeve and adding volumes with my clay builder brush, and after that I'm making sure that there is some kind of crease in there with my diamond standard brush. And for the folds, I use my standard brush to add to it. So because there was a lot of different panels in the sleeve, I'm adding those paneling with my diamond standard brush. But the panel look like that one panel is going down and the other one is coming top of it. So I'm refining the forms and putting one underneath the other using my clay builder brush, and moving it down the other panel, and then sculpting it using my standard brush and moving the other panel on top of it. And for the creases, I'm using my Damien standard brush to cutting into it. So that's why I said that your lines should be very smooth while working on the character, and you should practice on that, because as you can see that I'm drawing a very smooth line. And well, even for me, these much of smooth line won't be easy. I'm using my lazy mouse with a radius of 30 and adding all those details. For Medivian standard brush, the lazy radius is 53, because for sharp crisp lines I'm exaggerating the lazy radius, because I want it to turn out smooth and crispy. So for the edge, I'm using mask by borders to mask out the edge as well, and then inflating it out to make sure that it looks crispy and sharp. Right now I'm sculpting the folds. So you can see that I am looking at the tension points where the folds should be, and it is also very important that you should know the material of clothes. For example, if your cloth is cotton, then it will have very sharp and crisp cloth folds on top it. But if it's a leather jacket or some different kind of material, then there will be some soft and very smooth wrinkles on top of it. It won't be as sharp as a cotton material. So right now I am sculpting and adding volumes on the collar of the coat, and making sure it's clean using my edge polish brush to make sure it stays sharp and crisp. Because I'm doing the same thing over and over again, I will add some music and in the background, and you should watch the rest of the video. If there is something I think that needs explaining, I will jump back in and say some words. And if you like my videos and you want me to keep making videos like this, you can donate and show your support on my Patreon account. Thanks for watching.